All right, so thank you so much for having me. I just wanted to give a quick note real quick. Fantastic conference organizing, so as the closing keynote, you've got to thank them. So give a hand to all the staff, the organizers of the conference. And I want to give a special shout out, of course, amazing speakers. Some of these talks really kind of mind-blowing. I want to specifically call out the lightning talk speakers, all of them. I don't know many of them, but they were all fantastic and blew my mind. And so special round of applause for all of them. So I got to be honest. I know it may not seem like it, but I'm in near panic mode. Even as I stand up here right now, because what on earth am I doing speaking in a closing keynote, no less, at a React conference? I mean, those of you that have followed me, you know that I'm kind of known as the anti-framework guy. So in a room full of React aficionados and experts, I'm clearly, definitely the odd one out. Some of you may have seen another talk of mine, Confessions from an Imposter. And in this world here, I most definitely, positively, am an imposter. But in that talk, I assert that imposter is not, it's a positive identity that we should lean into, not something negative. That kind of imposterism is not about deception. It's quite the opposite. It means that you're being open about what little bits you know and what mountain of bits you don't know yet. It's a willingness to do before and while learning. And that's critical. It's not only for your own journey, but critical for everyone around you. Because that's really the only way that progress is made. And so, hi, React Imposter here. And I thank you for being patient with me, like a new toddler taking his first wobbly, unstable steps. When you see the React code that I've written, naive and silly as some of it may be, thank you for being patient with me. Please don't think that I'm asserting in any way that, hey, look, here's the best way to do something in React. Absolutely not. Like any toddler, and those of you that are parents in the crowd, you'll certainly appreciate this. There's plenty of messes, even the explosive kind, that I'm surely about to make. But if I can make progress in whatever topic or community that can be focused on at any given moment, you can too. You don't have to sit quietly and timidly by while all the other loud and influential voices with their YouTube channels and their X monetization checks waving in our faces, do they get to enjoy all the engagement, spotlight, and attention? No. You have a spot, just like an outsider like me has a spot. So, let's jump to the burning question that I'm sure is going through most of your minds. Why? Why this particular topic as a closing keynote? Why are we talking about declarative versus imperative? That seems like something that we should just write a blog post about and move on. I think this is really critical, and it's why I wanted to carve out time for us to talk about it. I'm definitely a broken record on this point. Those of you that have followed me have heard me say this many, many times, and I'm certainly not the only one. But the importance of optimizing our code for the readability by humans rather than optimizing for the understanding of computers. I think of it as a happy side effect that the computer can figure out what I'm suggesting. The most important thing is, can I communicate my ideas to other human beings? I'll also say this, which I know many of you are going to like head scratch on. It's very counterintuitive. Code must first be read before it can be written. But it's true. Number one, I believe our brains go through a sort of reading of code as we visualize and formulate the ideas that we're typing out. If what we're typing is hard to read in that pre-scan phase, there's a pretty good chance it will come out flawed. Most of us are also copying and pasting and maybe editing code, either from Stack Overflow, if you're old school like me, or from ChatGPT for all the hipsters in the room. We have to be able to read that code before we can use it to write our own code, right? And thirdly, most code is not greenfield in an empty file. It's added to or modifying existing code. And that code could have been written by somebody else, usually, or sometimes just our past selves. Any code that passes through any of these phases of our process is being read before we write it. Studies say we spend 70% of our time on our non-meeting, at the keyboard type, reading code. And yet we seem to spend more effort in our industry optimizing for how easy it is to quickly write code, doing more with fewer lines. I think we should be optimizing for the thing we spend the most time on, reading code. And I'll say this as well, as soon as you write some code, you are no longer accurate judge of its readability. And that might hurt a little bit. But see, you'll tend to feel a natural emotional affinity for any code that you just wrote. Well, of course, if the test passes, otherwise it's going to be anger. But that familiarity will skew your judgment. You'll forgive your own code much more than someone else's. Also, you inevitably are thinking about way more context in this mental bubble floating around your head than what you wrote down in the code. When you read it back, you still have all of that mental context, so of course the code makes sense. It hasn't been garbage collected yet. But none of that mental context exists for any others, so they have to reconstruct it only from what you put in the file. And most of the time, that's harder for others than it is for ourselves. So if you wait a while or ask someone else, other developers or your future self, they are much better positioned to provide feedback on the readability of your code. Stop trusting at first glance reaction after you manage to get a clever piece of code passing the tests. That's not readability. All right, time to clear up some definitions here. First of all, what's imperative? What's declarative? Let me answer these questions right off the bat. If you don't get that, that's a pun on the Who's On First comedy bit. What is not imperative? What is declarative? Said this way, imperative is about how the code does what it's doing, and declarative code focuses on what we want as the outcome, and more importantly, why. So imperative code is necessary because something in the system has to tell it what to do. Something has to give it those instructions. But if we have a given piece of our code and we focus on trying to understand exactly each little individual step, well, that's more imperative code. And if we focus on the bigger picture of why am I doing this, what is the purpose of this piece of code, then that is more declarative in style. So it's the instructions and the flow control, the decision-making, the conditionality of our code. That is the imperative parts of our program. And the declarative parts, if any, and hopefully more than imperative, are where we express the non-conditional intent of our program. Imperative, you might think of it this way, it's like the program input. It's the source code going in because the focus is on getting the computer to do something. Declarative code is focused on something entirely different. It's focused on the behavioral output of the program. Another way of saying this is that imperative code is explicit generally. It's very explicit in what you want to have done, whereas declarative code is implicit. It implies that things will happen, but does not necessarily give precise instructions on how. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but my brain always tries to get these swapped because of the IMP and the EX, and they sound like they ought to be switched, right? But that's a terrible idea because we all know we should never name our variables with the negation of a value. So we're just going to have to remember that imperative is explicit, declarative is implicit. That does not mean that there is no code in our programs that is doing that work. It means that the primary focus at that point as we read the code, that those details have been abstracted away. So abstraction, there's another word that does a lot of work in our industry. What does that mean? People use this all the time and they mean lots of different things. If an abstraction is well defined, it will bring great benefit to your code. Many people think that the purpose of abstraction is to hide implementation details, and let me say that is not the case. The main purpose of abstraction is to separate concerns, such that you could read the implementation independent of how it's used, or vice versa, and understand each without understanding the other. It's not, oh, I don't want to deal with that code, so I hide it inside of a function and nobody ever looks at it. That's not abstraction. It's not mature coding, but that passes for abstraction in many of our code bases. It's about separating concerns, and it's also about creating mental models that allow us to map from one domain to the other, from the implementation domain to the usage domain and back. The mental model is the important part, because that's what's going to aid our readers in understanding what's going on. This concept of imperativity and declarativity, it's a spectrum, not a binary. There's no such thing as an absolutely imperative or absolutely declarative program, or even a single line of code. It's a spectrum, and we have to get comfortable with working around that spectrum. And by the way, I'm going to illustrate that with everybody's favorite tool, ChatGPT. I prompted this to ChatGPT, pretty straightforward. Now, allegedly, natural language generative AI is near the pinnacle of declarative interface, right? That's like exactly where we hope to get to someday. We can just speak and it'll just figure out what we want and it's done. But even in this simple example, we already see a bit of leaky abstraction. More on that in a bit. Now, the ChatGPT looked pretty declarative, and when I compare it to the JavaScript version of that code, the ChatGPT looked declarative. This looks imperative. Right? We can say, well, that's definitely imperative code compared to ChatGPT. But what if I throw up the C program implementation? Now, all of a sudden, the JavaScript starts to look a whole lot more declarative, doesn't it? Compared to the C program. And if we keep going down the stack, and by the way, disclaimer, I did not write this code, ChatGPT did, so do not trust it. But this is the assembly language implementation. Now all of a sudden, that C code looks positively declarative, doesn't it? It's all about perspective. It's a relative spectrum. So which perspective are we most concerned with in this case? The reader of the code, not the author. So declarativity is about establishing, and I'll use this term grammar, I'm using air quotes here, for describing our intended outcomes. You could substitute a mechanism, a vocabulary, a model for describing our intended outcomes. Definitely, it involves a lot about naming things, and I know that we're historically very bad at that. But it's also about organizing, separating some things, combining others. Let me give an example here. Print amount x plus y. Pretty straightforward. Most people probably wouldn't have any issue with this code. But let me give you an alternative of this code that I think maybe is better. And some of you are going to say, well, why would you declare a variable just to pass it in? Especially if you're of the functional programming persuasion. Expressions should just flow through the program as easily as possible, and it feels like this hiccup, this barrier anytime you have to assign something to a variable. Let me suggest to you that giving a name to that computation aids in the mental model of this program. It tells me why am I adding x and y. It's because I have a total that I want something to do with. Giving it a simple name like that moves it more in the declarative. So even though it might feel counterintuitive, I would say that the const total is more declarative. But I'm not done with that example. Because we could start with this, or we could compare to this version. In one version, in the top version, I'm using the actual operator in line, and here I've declared this other function called add2nums. If you wanted to get really cute about it, you might just call it inc for increment, or add, or something like that, right? So is the second version of this code better? Is it more declarative? Does adding the name add2nums to the context of the plus operator aid in our understanding of the intent of the program? That's the metric we should be using to decide if it's declarative or not, and I'm going to suggest that probably it doesn't aid that much. You see, so this is a very fine line, and there's a lot of subjectivity here. Some of you may vehemently disagree. But declarativity is absolutely not absolute. You know that ChatGPT example from a couple of minutes ago? The first time I tried it, it looked like this. And it wasn't quite what I was hoping for, because I'd already done the other coding examples. And so you know what I had to do? I had to get a little bit more specific in my prompt engineering. I had to get a little bit more specific and tell ChatGPT, no, use first-person voice in this. And if you squint at it, that looks a lot more imperative than declarative, doesn't it? The more we have to specifically tell ChatGPT what to do, is it really still being declarative for us? So good design of declarativity is going to resist the leaking of implementation details. You shouldn't have to understand the implementation details to be able to use the declarative abstractions on top. But that's not to say that you shouldn't have any knowledge of or access to those details. This is not about hiding, it's about separating. It is also true that good design of declarativity admits the need for imperativity to refine our outcomes. It expects that, it knows it's going to happen, and it plans for it instead of bolting it on later. Some of our systems do that well, and some of them not so well. We need a holistic awareness of the system, awareness of the users, in this case the readers of our code, and awareness of where and how those separated imperative bits are doing their job. We also have to be very disciplined because it can be exhausting. I think it's a rigor and a discipline to not fall back to the easier imperative shortcuts. When there's a clear and useful declarative expression of your intended outcome, we should prefer that, but it's not always the easiest. It's just like you should try really hard never to fall back to the any in TypeScript. Same thing. Declarativity also requires balance. It's cliche, but in all things, moderation, balance, and especially here. A good program is one that deftly balances this tricky, teetering jumble of code ideas. I can't prescriptively tell you that's declarative, that's imperative. I've been designing a programming language lately. It's called FOI, whose goal is to perhaps strike a maybe slightly better balance between functional programming declarative idioms and familiar imperative techniques. Many other languages have tried it, and I'm hoping maybe I do it slightly better. Probably won't. But let me quote from this language's mission statement. The right things should be intuitive, the risky things should be apparent, the problematic things should be difficult or impossible. And I maybe suggest that we should adopt that mindset with everything that we build. So, some examples, and keep in mind that grammar, that framework, that mental model that we're using are criteria to determine where we are on the spectrum of imperativity and declarativity as we go through these examples. Remember that imperativity is characterized by flow control, decision-making, conditionality. So wherever we see that, we know the needle must be moving back along the spectrum towards imperativity. SQL, one of the most canonical examples of a declarative programming language, right? But it's not only that we can put literal conditionals in there like the case statement. That is definitely an insertion of imperativity into an otherwise declarative language. But even more than that is that there are implementation details that leak into how we design our SQL queries. For example, the order of fields in a where clause might affect which indexes the database system is going to use. So we might deliberately list the fields in one particular order, and that's not going to be obvious at all in the SQL statement. You see the imperativity leaking through. It is important to note, I think I've said this, but I want to make sure you get it. Declarativity is not saying that there can't be conditionality or flow control happening. There absolutely has to be. But it is that it should be more implied rather than outright, in-your-face, explicit. Okay, CSS. Conditionality. Lots of different ways that CSS can express conditionality. If you squint, you can almost see with the nesting that these look like literal if statements. You see, whereas normal CSS selectors are conditional only on the presence or absence of an element in the DOM, which I think we would all agree is pretty declarative, these features are conditional based on user behaviors. They're based on things like how they hold the device, or the operating system preferences like dark mode or font size, or how updated the OS is, or even whether they've interacted with elements on the page. Imperativity is definitely creeping into CSS, more and more these days it seems, and some is perfectly fine. But we have to remember the balance, and I'm not so sure that maybe we haven't crept a little too far. Okay, the king of all declarativity, right? HTML, it's just markup, it's just latent content. Here again, we see conditionality creeping into an otherwise declarative language. The alt and the placeholder attributes, they provide content that is only shown in certain cases in response to device and user behaviors. And literally the nesting of the fallback content inside of the canvas and no script, that actually looks like if statements, doesn't it? Okay, I know I'm going to get flamed for this one, but as we turn our attention to JavaScript, we start out with everyone's favorite JavaScript villain, the double equals operator. I can already feel the daggers coming at me. All four of these are essentially identical in outcome and behavior. Not strictly so, as the middle two are a tiny, tiny bit slower than the first and the last. Just a tiny bit. But I want you to ask yourself, on a given line of code that may do a comparison like this, if you're certain that the x variable will only ever have a number or a string, because, yay, TypeScript, then is it actually important for the user to contend with this idea of threeness with the implementation detail that it might be a 3 number or a 3 string? Is that important to the reader and the user of that code at that moment? Or is it an unimportant implementation detail? If the TypeScript ensures that the x only has the number of string, and we're absolutely sure that we're comparing non-zero, non-empty string values like we are here, there's absolutely no quirky corner cases of coercion whatsoever. None. Nada. So I think a reasonable case can be made that double equals here is the most declarative of the options. It implicitly handles the coercion, which in this particular case is perfectly safe. And I want to ask, is there really something to be gained for sliding the scale back down to more explicit imperativity here? I would say I don't think so. And let me really fan the flames. You ready? TypeScript users should be the biggest proponents of double equals, because TypeScript actually eliminates all of the places where double equals might go wild. TypeScript makes double equals the winner. Yeah, I know. Let's move on. All right, so we have a classic example here of doing things with an if statement versus a ternary versus this somewhat newer nullish coalescing operator down here on the bottom. Now, most people are going to look at the first version of this and say, it's a little too kind of naive, right? We're assigning a variable in two different places, and there's some potential gotchas there. So most people are going to look at that and be like, that's not quite what I want. But is that null coalescing operator really carrying its own weight? I mean, it's really just a ternary where we separated out the colon part of the clause and took it out because it's already been combined. So it's kind of like a magician's sleight of hand. Now, also, the double question mark operator there, if you didn't notice, both of my previous examples are using a double equals null. And that's what the double question mark is abstracting away for us. So wait a minute, why is the double question mark, it's okay for it to abstract away a double equals, but a double equals can't abstract away all those explicit coercions? All right, so here's another classic example where we are comparing the imperative style to the functional programming style. And functional programming clearly puts its case out that it is the declarative version of code and that it is superior. If you've ever talked to a functional programmer, you definitely know that. So we don't have a reassignment going on in the second one, and that's one of the major reasons that they love it. That's why we get to use the const keyword, because there's no reassignment of that names variable, as opposed to needing to do a let to reassign. But we do have the cost that now you have to step into a different domain, which the reader of your code may or may not understand, which is these higher order functions, the filter, the map, the reduce. Now, I love those tools, and I've used them for years and years and years, and I would definitely personally prefer this. But do all members of the team have that same context? Is this absolutely improving the declarative mental model of this code? I think it's a bit of a trade-off. All right, let's move to JSX since we're on a React conference. I saw this example, so I just thought I would call this out. The button component here has a option where you can have the text attribute to give it its value, or you can just put the text directly in there. And there was a claim being made that the one with the text property was the better version. And I scratched my head and I thought, to me, the one where the text goes exactly where it belongs instead of needing to be placed somewhere else by some magical framework, to me, that's the more declarative version of this. It's saying, I want a button that says submit. I'm not telling you that it has to go specifically to a property named text. Here's another example of some JSX. Our friend, the double question mark, kicking back in. Is this more declarative? We've got conditionals going on, so what do we think? Does this count as declarative just because it's JSX? Or is this really just an alternate syntax for imperative JavaScript code? I think it's more the latter. Here's another one in JSX. I saw this in an app that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. I see this actually in a lot of places, right? So there's plenty of places in JSX where the nesting of your component tags represents actual DOM elements. And since we're using a DOM-like, HTML-like syntax, there's a good one-to-one mapping there, right? But that's not what this is. This is like nested function calls, because these don't represent any actually rendered DOM elements. We just use that because it's convenient to stay in the same domain of language of JSX, but does it actually make more sense here? There are other pre-established standards for how we declaratively handle function composition. We could do it the old school way by just calling these functions and passing them inside of a nested DOL. Or we could use compose. If you're a functional programmer, you love the compose utility. Or we could use this, seems like mythical pipe operator, seems like it never is going to land, but the pipe operator that they're promising for JavaScript. I would say either of the latter two is better than the first one, and I think these are a better language for describing what's going on than hanging on to the JSX simply because that's what the other part of that code is doing. HTMX, I definitely don't have the social media meme game of HTMX. They do a fantastic job, but they sort of put on the label like, hey, we're the whole declarative thing, right? I looked through a bunch of the examples on HTMX, and it was pretty good. And then I started seeing stuff like that, and I was like, okay, well, here we are, back to sliding towards imperativity, and their version of sliding towards imperativity seems to be putting this other language, which I think is called hyperscript, inside of strings, inside of attributes. Of the various ways that we might give an imperative affordance, I would put this at the very bottom of the list in terms of my preference. Okay, that's a bunch of code, and I think we need a palate cleanser. For just a moment, you get to see a cat eating a dessert. I don't want to wear you out. Okay. I'm not done yet. We're just getting started. Okay. So I want to set some context for you, pun intended, because I want to talk about a React app I've been building recently. Disclaimer again, remember what I said at the start of my talk. This does not mean it's a prescriptive message of, look at this code, do it like I did it. Quite the opposite. My real intent is to share with you what it was like when someone with a decent amount of web and JavaScript experience from outside of React came into React and how they react when they start using React. Now say that 4 times fast. Many of you in this room have been doing React so long, you maybe don't even remember what it was like to not know React. In fact, a lot of you started with React, so it's mostly all you've ever known. It's all too easy to forget what it was like when you first started. It's the curse of learning anything well. The more you know it, the harder it is to empathize with others who were earlier on that arc of learning and discovery. I think one of the core tenets of React, and broadly all of the component libraries out there, I think one of the core tenets is that the benefits are for declarative UI. We heard that term in a couple of other talks at this conference. But quite honestly, I was pleasantly surprised. React frees me from worrying much or any about this whole DOM diffing process or reconciling the current state of the UI and what is the next state. That's my comfort zone, by the way. Prior to React, I've always enjoyed that fine-grained imperative control and doing exactly like with a scalpel, the only thing that needs to have happen. I used to use mustache templates and compose partials, and I'd render only a minimal level of what needed to change. That's my comfort zone. But React and the components, that world, they're saying, the declarative UI world, they're all saying, hey, listen, don't waste all your time thinking about that. Trust us. Trust the VDOM. We've got you. And for the most part, they do got me. They do have the DOM updates under control. I still miss it. I liked knowing what was going on and having that control, but giving up that control was not as painful as I expected. But, and there's always a but, declarative UI is only part of the story. What about UX? That's the real issue here, I think. I don't think most can take an honest issue with React being decent at expressing declarative UI. But how does it fare when expressing declarative UX? That I'm not so sure. I think that's where many of its issues start to creep in, and it may very well be what has inspired the whole next generation of frameworks to come along and suggest things like signals. Those are not the silver bullet either, by the way. I could do a whole talk on those. They're great, they're awesome, they're not a silver bullet. So what specifically am I talking about with UX? Well, I mean things like when I click on a button to fire off an asynchronous action, what immediately happens is feedback. Do I see some sort of spinner or other indicator that confirms to me that the system heard my click and that it's working on a response? And more directly, if it's going to show me a spinner, does it show it right away, even if the response comes back so quick that it causes only the briefest of flickers, where it shows the spinner and hides it right away once the content is there? Or on the other side of the coin, if the operation is taking long enough that I'm seeing the spinner actually go on for a bit, do I have some way as a user of changing my mind and saying, actually, no, let me cancel that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to wait. Can I do that? Should I do that? Or here's another one. I have a search box where I type in text. When I click the search button, what happens to the text that I typed in? Does it always stay in the text box? Does the text box clear out at some point, either on success of the search results coming back, or failure to provide any results? If it stays in the text box, what happens if I keep typing after I've clicked search, while the results spinner is still going? Declarative UX for any of these nuanced user experiences? Not so much. At least as far as I can tell. React noob here, so I'm sure somebody's ready to tell me there's a library for that. Here's another example where event handling goes. This was a big issue for me. It's quite clear that React wants you to just put all your event handlers directly on the JSX elements and not worry about it. Just let it happen. React has it all covered, supposedly, and I got to tell you folks, that's tough for me. I was baptized in the religion of separating behavior and markup way back in the day. It's a deeply held religious belief at this point, and it's really hard to convert religions. So I created a series of checkboxes, which I styled as CSS toggle switches, and each pair is acting as a set of basic config settings for the app. And so these two checkboxes are logically grouped together as a single toggle control. I wanted a handler for responding to a changing of any of these setting toggles. One, to update the search results, of course, and two, to persist the configuration. This is basic stuff, right? In the non-React imperative UI world, I'd set a single change event handler on the parent element of each of these toggles. So again, one handler for each pair of checkboxes. It irks me to no end to think that I'd bind the handler twice, unnecessarily, once to each checkbox. No, event delegation is how you handle this. So the change event doesn't bubble up, so I did some Googling around and figured out that even though I needed the capture phase, I was going to have to switch from on-change to on-change capture. Great, I got that working. But then I ran into this tangled mess of errors that React was reporting to me. Squawked at me about something about managed versus non-managed, because I had also the checked attribute on these to handle not only the initial checked from the configuration, but also if something asynchronously updated into the background. And React was like, no, no, no. You can't use that because you don't have an on-change handler directly on each one of those checkboxes. There was no declarative way, at least that I could find, to tell it, hey, it's cool. It's on the parent element. I gotcha. No, I couldn't do that. So I fumbled around a bit, and I eventually landed at default checked, but there was other problems with that because then it wasn't updating in other cases. So you can probably guess that I eventually had to settle for resolving this conflict with, yep, some imperative code. Here, the declarative UX failed me. All right, I've digressed way down some rabbit holes here, so let me back up before it's too late and I lose all of you. I'm going to show you this app that I built as part of my learning of React. I actually used the Redwood.js framework, which bundles in React. And I found it quite surprisingly pleasant how easily Redwood.js handled setting up and managing a bunch of tooling around React that I didn't want to learn or figure out. The Vite bundler, dev server, all that jazz. So this is my experience report from the trenches from a total React noob. If I struggled with these things, what, if anything, does that say about the suitability of these tools? React, namely, at providing the proper type of declarative grammar for expressing not only intended UI, but also intended UX. And in a bigger sense, is React not actually all that concerned with this issue? Is that why there's a huge ecosystem of every library you can think of under the sun? Because they're just not worried about that problem? When you want to express user experience reasonably, do you have to drown in all of the other bits of the ecosystem? I didn't want to, and I resisted it with everything in me. I didn't want to yak shave myself into learning a bunch of other stuff around React. I was determined to build what I could, UI, UX, state management, all of it, only with what I get out of the box from React. Is that a good way of going about it? It would seem probably not. But at least I can say I was absolutely intentional about that. I did it completely on purpose. So through all of your cringing at what I'm about to show you, please just keep my explicit intent in mind. Enough ado. This is the app I present to you, WeatherRound. A no-nonsense, completely free, completely privacy-preserving, serverless, no-frills weather forecast app. I'll pause briefly while you also bask in the glory of my very pedestrian, certainly not award-winning design skills. I quite doubt there's a Webby award coming my way. But at least it's not the black and white HTML text like my personal website's been for 20 years. I tried to design something. Anyway, let's look at the code underneath it. So in this app, I have several different components, 3 specifically that I'm going to call out here. I have the search component, I have the current location component, and I have the weather component. Okay? Pretty straightforward stuff. Notice that the weather component also has this other little configuration option widget kind of up there. It does not visually or even conceptually make sense that it's inside of the weather component, but all of the configurations there affect how the weather is fetched. That's where it needs that information, so of course that's where I put it. That was the first of many flags that I found. All right, so here is my terrible React code. This is my home page component, and you'll notice that I'm making plenty use of use states and use refs. Notice here specifically that I've got an object where I've got some Boolean properties on it inside of a use state. Instead of keeping those separately inside of a use state slot, I'm putting those into an object. Why? You can probably guess, because I ran into all kinds of problems with the rendering cycle. Things rendering too often or not often enough. Actually, I had the latter problem far more often. It's very aggressive in saying, nope, I'm not re-rendering. So I had to kind of hack my way through this very imperatively. Notice also down here that I'm changing those values back because they're only used for one cycle of the render loop to signal that something has happened, like I've canceled a request or I've reset the location request. So I'm resetting it immediately after we've gone through one set of the loop, but I don't want that to cause another render loop, so that's why I can't just update a state slot or it would queue up another re-render. All right, let's take a look at a few of the components here. I mentioned the search component. Let me talk through just a few of the things that are in this search component that are being passed in. We have the location found. That's a Boolean flag. The search component needs to know if that's been found. And you're like, Why? Well, because the search component does not want to do its clearing out of the search text box if you didn't find the location. So I need to tell it, was the location search successful? Then I have the search text, that's pretty straightforward, and a set search text, that probably makes sense. Set selected location, again, sort of an interesting layering violation here, right? That should be part of the current location widget. Why am I passing that in here? And you might not have noticed, I'll go back to the homepage code in just a moment, but on the homepage code, I'm calling out to my use get location custom hook. Why in the homepage instead of in the current location widget where that would make sense? We'll get to all of that. So the current location, I have to pass in whether I've got the location or a specifically selected location, because that's another part of the feature there. I've got to pass in methods for activating a location from a drop-down list or canceling a location, resetting a location, and, because why not, a Boolean flag to let you know whether that actually happened. All of these are things that I didn't set out to design. I hacked them in later because something wasn't working, right? So this is design that emerged rather than design that was planned. Finally, the weather component. Again, same kind of thing that you see going on here. I'm passing in the location, and here's why now you see that I need the location at the homepage element. Because I can't reach down inside of the current location object and get its hooks or its data out, so I have to lift it up to the parent, because I have two siblings that need to share this information. Yes, I know there's probably a million other state management ways. David probably can tell us exactly how to fix that. But remember, I'm just working with all that I've got from React. All right, let me give you another break. Cute kitten. Okay. So let's take a look at a few of those functions just so you see. Reset location state right there. You see that I'm setting a new object into it. And the reason I'm doing that, you can see the hack comment there. I'm doing that because that's the way to force a re-render, is to actually set a new value. So there are times when I want the changes to those to force a render, and times when I don't. That's not something that I found easy to model, so I hacked this imperative version of that. Do cancel location, pretty straightforward. Do reset location. Not a lot to call out here, other than to just say, I actually was pleasantly surprised at how clean this part of the code was. Most of it I was able to abstract into the different components, so there's only a few of these layering concerns that filtered their way in. Again, do activate location, same thing. If I've specifically selected it from a drop-down, which is in a child component, I've got to signal that back up to the parent, so that's what's happening here. A few other of those kind of cleanup functions. If I'm activating the weather or canceling the weather, I need to flip that. Again, I need the weather state up at the parent because both location and weather need to know about that state. So frustrating. And then you see this clear search input. That's one of two places that I want to clear out the search input box. So I had to actually have an external reference to the search input box using forward graph, and an internal reference to the same box to do it there as well. Ugh. All right, more cats. Back to the home page. I mentioned that I have my custom hook, use get location. I've got another one for getting the weather. That one is actually inside of the weather component. Yay! But this one had to be out here, which doesn't make any sense. But that's why all this location and weather state has been hoisted up, is because I didn't have any other clean way that I could figure out for them to share that information. And the real problem that I had with use get location is that it's asynchronous. It's going to go and do fetching calls, right, against APIs. I don't know what it's going to do until I call it. But it's sort of like this black box. I guess that's the point of it being declarative, is that it's this black box, but I don't know what it's going to do. And so it's got to return me back something. What is it going to return me back? Well, let's look real quickly inside of it. First of all, I told you I wanted to handle cancellation. Couldn't figure out any declarative way to say from the outside, hey, hook, cancel what you're doing. So I had to hack that in with abort controller, and thankfully this is coming soon to JavaScript natively, the with resolvers. I'm really glad for that. But I needed a way to signal, if you will, that it should cancel all the work all the way down to the fetch call. Here's probably the ugliest imperative code that I had in the app, other than inside of the hooks themselves, was this perform location lookup Boolean, because I do want to decide internally. I want that to be a thing that I figure out internally. Should I perform the request, or should I let the request keep going? Because there are times that the parent component re-renders that should not affect anything about a location lookup. And there are other times when the parent component re-renders and calls the hook that do signal, hey, we're being reset or canceled. Got to figure that out. That's what this Boolean's all about. And then down here, you notice, that's my abstraction. I handle all that junk on the inside, and I just hand you back something that's either a promise for a location, or the location itself, and a Boolean that says if it's been found. Here's a bit of the cancellation logic. Again, kind of some ugly imperative if statement stuff. But I've kept via closure a reference to the cancellation handler from the previous render in one of these use refs, and I call it. And then that's what this looks like when I'm canceling. This is me canceling down, calling the abort controller to cancel down, and also canceling up, canceling the promise that I've handed back to the parent component. We're almost through the code, I promise. I know you're worn out. And I'm between you and the beer, I know that. All right, my ugly use effect. We can't get away without talking about use effect. Every other day, it's either the most amazing thing that React ever did or the worst thing that React ever did. I can't really keep track, especially as an outsider. But I read something somewhere that said use effect is what you're supposed to do to synchronize your components with external side effects. Well, making an API call sounds an awful lot like an external side effect, so this seemed like the reasonable approach. Unfortunately, I could not indicate to use effect that there was more that was going into the decision of whether it should run or not, because even if I listed out all the variables in that little Boolean, if any one of them changed, it's going to rerun the use effect, even when I don't want it to. So I just had to do the if statement there. And this is where I'm saving in for the next time around if I need to cancel it, and then clearing that out. Almost done. Get location is a pattern that I developed for a cancelable asynchronous function. Now, I actually have a library for this, but I didn't want to use any libraries, even my own, so I just came up with something where it's a regular function, and then inside of it an object with the promise and the controller on it that runs the asynchronous operation. And so it can chain those down. The signals come in, get abort controller there, chains the signals. So even if I had 15 levels deep of that work, if I call the cancel, it's going to propagate all the way down. This is not a failure of React. This is a failure of JavaScript to not handle cancellation better. Okay. I promise that was the end of the code. I'm almost done here. This app, if you care, is available live on weatherround.com. That's 1R. Okay, so that was a lot to get through. Would you say that maybe we weathered the storm? No, that's a bad pun. Okay. All right. I know I went way over, but my final thoughts. Back to the discomfort that I talked about to open my talk. I don't yet know what the full thematic big takeaway message is here. Usually when you prepare a talk, you start with that one big North Star guiding you, and then you point the audience there and say, is that there? That's where we're going. But I'm honestly still figuring out what and where that is. So I guess I'm asking you, my audience, what and where will that be? I won't really know for a while, not until I see what, if any, impact this talk has had on the bigger discussions that we're having as a community and a broader industry. You have more influence over what this talk's ultimate message is than I do. Will the questions I posed make any difference? Perhaps some part of this talk made you a bit uncomfortable? Will any of you walk out of here still pondering what the point was? Will you go back and debate any of those questions with your teams at work? And will that ever change how you approach a single line of code? Will I, sitting out there in the audience in the very near future, get to see one of you up here sharing some important new insights into any of these questions? I don't know yet. I guess we'll see. Thanks very much for listening.